I was in the Valley and I was on Ventura Boulevard, and I happened to pass by one of the, numerous sushi places
Hmm.
that are a little tiny, I'm talking about like the really tiny hole in the wall type of spots. And I got to thinking about the history of sushi in America specifically. There's this book, I think it might be called Sushi. Um, and it's this interesting timeline that jumps back and forth between the origins of sushi in Japan and then also
Right.
the origins of it becoming popular in America and specifically in LA. And and I was kind of laughing to myself about, if you talk to most hardcore LA natives, you ask them for where the best sushi spot is. They've always got some sneaky place on Ventura
Right.
Boulevard in the Valley.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about? I mean, shoot, you're an LA native. I mean,
No, everyone has their own favorite sushi place. I think for me though, growing up in the San Gabriel Valley and being so close to like Little Tokyo, and my mom is from the South Bay, so like Torrance and Gardena area, like that's where I gravitated towards. But yeah, no, everyone. It's funny that you say that because one of my coworkers who's also Japanese American like me, uh, I was just talking to him because Valentine's Day was coming up, and I was like, I need to get some sushi because it's Valentine's Day, I guess. And I asked him, I was like, where do you get sushi? And he was like, this is the only place to get sushi. And I'm like, dude, that's not the only place, but what's your favorite place? Right. And he was like, it's this place in Culver City. I was like, awesome, thank you. Right. And he was like wholly convinced that that was like the best place,
the
right, to
secret.
get sushi. And I'm like, I'm sure that's one of many, given how many Japanese there are and Japanese Americans there are in Los Angeles.
And for the listeners who don't have context, so the San Gabriel Valley where you grew up, give them context of where that is in the greater Los Angeles area.
Yeah, so the San Gabriel Valley is just east of downtown. It kind of occupies kind of everywhere between, I guess you would say, like, eastern Los Angeles all the way to the border is, I guess, like Pomona, Claremont. Those are kind of the areas before you get into like San Bernardino and Riverside.
Yeah, like the foothills, like Claremont's getting up into the foothills of the mountains
Yeah,
there, right?
yeah,
And
yeah.
and I think most Angelinos, when they think of San Gabriel Valley, they think of Chinese Americans potentially, or even Latinos and whatnot. Was there a large Japanese American or Japanese population in San Gabriel Valley when you were growing up?
So prior to the I would say probably the 80s, there was a Japanese American population out there. My father was actually born in Boyle Heights, and my grandfather, when he was a farmer, would actually farm in the San Gabriel Valley. I don't know, probably back in like the 30s. So yeah, there used to be pockets of, I think, Japanese Americans out there.
Yeah, I think I didn't know that. And I'm sure there's probably a lot of listeners that had no idea, especially, when we think of Boyle Heights specifically, we think Mexican American all day long, the rich history there. And I think a lot of people forget how many different pockets across LA have these really deep Japanese American roots, like, down in
Yeah.
Palos Verdes, where you grew up in the part of the eastern side of LA. And then I think most stereotypically people think where your mom's from, they think of the South Bay, of
Right.
the large populations down there. When now you're Japanese American, are you like your parents are both American as well, right? Were your grandparents Japanese, or was it your great grandparents that were Japanese? Like, what's the
Uh,
lineage look like for you?
yeah. So for me, it's a little bit non-traditional for, I think, a lot of Japanese Americans. Technically, I'm what they call a yonsei, which is fourth generation Japanese American. But both of my grandmothers, one of my grandmothers was born in Japan, and then came here after the war. And my other grandmother, interestingly enough, was born here in actually in off Terminal Island, near Long Beach. And then she was but then sent to Japan to get educated. So this was all prior to the war, and she came back after the war. And then my mother, it was actually born in Japan, but came here when she was, really little, like 2 or 3. So not a wholly like I can pass my lineage all however many years my family's been in America, but definitely have some connections to Japan, but mostly most of my family's in America.
I've never met anybody that had any sort of direct connection with Terminal Island. That's I don't know much about Terminal Island, but what little I do know, it is fascinating to me. Like, what do you know about it? Like, did you learn anything from your
Yeah,
grandma, from your mom? Like, what's up
not
with that?
yeah. Yeah, so I think back particularly, I believe prior to the war, when I say war, World War II, they it was actually it had a large Japanese slash Japanese American community, and a lot of that that location in particular was where a lot of seafood canning happened, from what I understand, and so. I guess my great grandparents of my grandmother moved out there and was, I believe, working in the canneries, and I only know this because I had there's I think an AMC show called The Terror, and it actually touches on the history of Japanese Americans on Terminal Island, and I don't know how historically accurate it is, but apparently there was like this little Japantown on the island, and there was like a little kind of main street area full of like Japanese goods and stuff like that. So yeah, my grandmother was born there, but there's a specific word for people like my grandmother, which is called kibe, and that means people who were born in Japan, or, I'm sorry, born in America, but were raised in Japan. So while someone might think that, oh, my grandmother, probably spoke perfect English, she actually had a very heavy Japanese accent when she spoke English, and her natural language was actually Japanese, despite being born here in America.
Wow, that's so specific to Los Angeles. That's just such a unique American story, and I guess Japanese and American, but American story.
Yeah,
And it was, I mean, I had lived here for years before I'd even heard of Terminal Island, and the fact that it's right there, plain as day, still right in the harbor, right off of San Pedro.
right. Yeah,
I think it's changed now. I think it's very shipping related and industrial and whatnot,
right,
but I can only imagine, thinking back to what it must have been like, to your point, pre-war, pre-World War II,
yeah,
pre-hostility against Japanese people in America, Th-
yeah.
that's that's an interesting history. So it sounds like your great grandparents and grandparents avoided the whole internment camp, black mark on our history.
No, actually. So my grandmothers did, but
Oh,
my grandfathers were both born and raised here in LA, and so their families experienced internment. One of my grandfathers was in Roar, out in Arkansas, and then my other grandfather was in Manzanar, which is probably the most famous of the internment camps.
and Manzanar is going out towards Yosemite, right? Like Mammoth Lakes, Yosemite
Yeah,
area.
Mammoth area. Yeah, it's on the way to Mammoth. Yeah,
Wow, I didn't realize that. Wow. So, that was something that, I grew up in Texas, and and when we're younger, we have courses called, like Texas history. I remember when I was in the seventh
right.
grade, one semester we had Texas history class, and we learned all about, Stephen F. Austin and the Alamo and all that stuff. And, we weren't exposed to regional history, let alone regional history that was really American history as it relates to, say, the internment camps. And it wasn't until I moved to Los Angeles that I had begun to hear whispers about it. And
Hmm.
I didn't really, it's not that I didn't believe it. I was like, how could this be possible that I have never heard about this, never met anybody that had any contact or relation with this? And it turns out my first boss in Los Angeles, the guy that hired me, was a much older gentleman. and he was at one of the camps, I think in Northern
Oh wow.
California. I don't think he was in Manzanar, and it affected him, man. Like
Yeah.
it put an edge on him that was
Right.
very, very specific, and understandably so. I mean, if I'm being honest, shoot, it's that's intense. Well, I didn't mean to
For
bring you.
sure.
I didn't mean to bring you down deep
No,
family
no,
tree
no.
conversation, but God, just so interesting the path that your family, I guess, and anybody's family takes. You know, especially if they're coming from a different country or a different culture,
For sure.
and that gets me thinking about your path. You know, your path beyond as it relates to you leaving LA and moving and living in Japan, like your own journey.
Yeah.
And I'm always curious to know when people end up moving, you know, wherever they move, whatever country they move to, and for whatever job they end up getting or whatever job they end up moving for, I'm always very curious as to know, like, was there like a major inflection point or was there a major thing in your brain when you were a kid? You're like, you know what? I'm going to move over there, or your high school or university. Like, is there anything that
Yeah.
you could put your finger on?
Yeah, so I think probably when I was in middle school, I have two older cousins who, when I was in middle school, they were just graduating college, and they both went to Japan to teach English as part of the JET program, and I had at that point in my life had been starting to get a little bit more interested in kind of my family history, but my Japanese culture, and I just thought that that was like the coolest thing, that they got to go somewhere else and live there, right, and teach English, but also then speak to my grandmother, right, who is Japanese, and Japanese was her first language, so they were able to converse with her, and I thought that that was really cool. And so from that point on, I was like, I'm going to do that, right? And so that was kind of everything that, not necessarily everything that I did, but the things that I did, I kind of started to prepare myself, right? Like starting to take Japanese courses in college, or starting to learn how to teach, right? Tutoring kids and stuff like that.
Did you were you starting from ground zero in your Japanese language ability when you began studying it, or did you have some sort of conversational or literacy?
Yeah, not really. Uh, I took Japanese. I was in Japanese school when I was a kid. I absolutely hated it. I think as a kid, especially, a lot of Japanese schools tend to be on Saturdays, and I just wanted to play and watch, Saturday morning cartoons. And so I absolutely hated it. And so after, I believe, like 2 or 3 years, I asked my parents if I could quit, and they obliged, surprisingly. And so in college, though, knowing that I wanted to go to Japan, I actually minored in Japanese. But I think there's a very, as with anything that you study, there's a very real difference between studying a language, right, and actually having to apply it practically in the real world. Right. And so I did, going into Japan, have basic knowledge, right? Very basic conversational, abilities.
Describe the JET program for people who've never heard of it, like what it is, and what the path was like for you to actually get information about it. Like, how did you even like, how did you know about the process? What'd that look like for you?
Yeah, so the JET program is a program hosted by the Japanese government, and they basically select people from all over, not only the English speaking world, but all over the world, to be teaching assistants in Japanese schools across Japan. And so how I got introduced to it, probably, right before I started, was um, the JET program also hosts and funds an alumni association, and their one of their chief kind of charges is to go out into the community and kind of talk about it at colleges and other communities to recruit. And I went to a recruiting session, and that's where I kind of learned how, all the entire process, which I will say is, especially in the LA area where there is greater interest than maybe other parts of the country or even the world, quite competitive, right? And so getting that information on how exactly do I make sure, that I get selected, there was a lot of, I was lucky, obviously, to have my cousins, but also to have, friends of friends who had done the JET program that kind of gave me pointers on, what to do and how to make sure that I would, get selected.
When you when you're planning for that, what year is this, by the way? Like what year did you officially land on the soil and begin working over there?
Yeah, so in 2006, the summertime of 2006.
Okay, so before that, you've got a couple years. You're trying not to be a knucklehead college student like most of us are trying not to be, and but at the same time, you're laser focused on this,
Yeah.
right? You've got family members, you've got friends of friends who can at least help you cobble together an image of what it's going to be like, or how you could prepare to your point, because it was competitive. What like what did that was there like a website, or like did at the campus event, did they just say, hey, here's a flyer, like go to this web page or send an email,
Yeah.
or what did that look like?
Yeah, so there was, a website, and they did hand out flyers. Not everything was online yet, and it felt very much like how you might go to kind of a college recruitment seminar, right? It was basically, a bunch of past jets that would kind of talk about their experiences, and then kind of, this is, here's all the things that you need to fill out, here's your, this is where you get your application, here are the next steps. And then from there, you fill out the application, you write an essay, and if you kind of pass that first phase, then you go into an interview, where you speak with, again, former jets, and they kind of interview you, ask you a bunch of questions on, you know kind of, for me in particular, I remember being asked, like, teach Christmas, right? Or like kind of, show, how both how you would teach Christmas to, kids that might not know anything about it, that what they only see on TV is a Christmas tree, right? So what is the, not necessarily the religious aspect of Christmas, which is important, but also the cultural aspect of Christmas that is kind of so ingrained in American culture, right? And so, yeah, after that, then you wait a couple months, and if you get selected, then they tell you where in Japan you get to go. Of course, beforehand, you kind of can set your preferences, but usually, at least from what I hear, you don't usually get your preferences, and you get kind of placed. And then, yeah, you're on a plane to Japan in the summertime.
When you were going through all that prep, like to your like you said, there's various, I guess, stages or hurdles you got to get through. And to your point, it was very competitive in the Los Angeles region. What was your mindset? Were you thinking, I think I got this, I know enough people, I'm prepped enough, uh, I've got obviously I've got some Japanese history in my family. Did you think I got this, or did you think, oh man, it's too competitive? I don't even know. Like,
Yeah, I was a nervous wreck. Every step, even from the application process, we were told that if you put, for example, your essay in front of your application, or basically misorder it, or don't use the same correct paper clips and stuff like that, that you'll immediately get rejected, right? So from that point on,
man.
yeah, from that point, you're always you're like, well, you second guess yourself after you submit it, and you put it in a FedEx envelope. You're like, ooh, did I do everything correct? Should I open that back up, and check to make sure? So from that point forward, it was super nerve-wracking. And the interview, even though, like, for the most part, they're previous jets, and they understand the experience, especially for a 22-year-old, not even finished graduating college, doesn't really know what the real world looks like, or possibly what an actual professional interview would even feel like, right? I was definitely nervous, and I walked in with a full-on suit, and somehow made it through.
That's interesting to me. The fact that you chose to wear a suit, not that that is a shock or that that was bad. It's that there's some people that didn't do that, and I know you've seen those people. You probably saw those people at the interview process, in the lobby or wherever the
Yeah.
interviews were held. Is that something about your personality? Like, when you get focused on a goal, are you just like one of those kinds of people that are just like, I'm buttoned up, I'm focused, I'm not going to have any variables that are going to take me out? Or is that just something you heard somebody said, hey man, wear a suit, and you're like, oh shoot, I better wear a suit?
Yeah, I think it was kind of a mixture of both, especially I think now, at least, especially now that I've moved a little bit farther in my career and professional life, and suits are less important. But especially at the time, I think there was kind of this mantra of if you're going to be a professional, you need to wear a suit. But also me not wanting to mess it up, right? Not wanting to
Hmm.
leave anything to chance, was like, well, like, better to be overdressed than underdressed, right? And
Sure.
so I remember going, I think, to like one of those suit factory stores just to get a suit, right? Because at that point, I'm a dumb college kid, not quite ready to graduate college yet. And so I got a suit. I'm sure it was ill-fitting because I had no idea how to
As
wear
they always are at
it.
that age.
Yeah, exactly, right. Nothing, probably, the sleeves were too long or whatnot, but I did my best, and I walked in there with a suit. So, I now, kind of when I think about it, I'm like, that's so interesting, as you point out, because as I've moved on my career, I work in an industry that is very casual now, and doesn't require me to be always buttoned up.
Hmm. Hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, it's amazing how quickly things have changed in that regard. And when you were talking about how the prep you were able to do and conversations you were able to have and the interaction with the alumni association, doing outreach and letting people like that the jet program existed.
Yeah.
I couldn't help but think about my experience and how totally different it was. When I didn't know anything about Japan other than that it was a country where there were like samurai. I grew up in Texas. I had
Yeah.
no Japanese friends, no Japanese people in the neighborhood. I had no context. And when I was doing my application process, I went to school down in San Marcos at Texas State, so which is
Hmm.
essentially a bedroom community to Austin. And I was at a coffee shop in Austin, and I was filling out my application, just like you were saying. I was paranoid that I was going to do something wrong, hamstring myself unintentionally by not following the strict process of actually completing the application. And I'm sitting there, and I had you probably, like a dictionary, Japanese dictionary, and maybe even probably a Japanese textbook there as well. And as I'm, scrutinizing these documents, to your point about stating your preference, for the listeners out there, during, at least at the time, whenever we are doing the process, I think it's like what, up to three preferences
Yeah.
of regions in the country where you would, best case scenario, where would you want to be? And I was stuck because I didn't know anything about Japan. I didn't know
Right.
anybody. I didn't have anybody to ask. And it's just interesting how serendipity just appears. I was sitting there, and this middle-aged Japanese lady walked in and double taked and walked past the table where I was sitting before she ordered, and walked right back. And she said, "Excuse me, what are you doing?" And I didn't understand her question. I was like, what do you mean? What am I doing? I'm minding my own
Yeah.
business. I'm, I'm filling out some stressful paperwork, lady. And she
Yeah.
said, "Oh, are you studying Japanese or in Japan?" I said, "Oh yeah, I'm hoping to get accepted into this program." And I explained to her what it was, and I said, "But I'm glad you stopped." I said, "I don't know anything about the climate or the towns or the regions." I said, "Do you have any recommendations of what I should put down as my preference?"
Right.
And so she stopped before she went to get her coffee, sat down at the table with me, and I had it was a little Xerox copy of a Japanese map.
Hmm.
And she proceeded to talk through the different regions, how the climates were
Oh,
different,
wow.
why they were different. And because of her kindness, I was like, okay, I'm going to put down, these three areas. And I got my first pick. And I don't
Wow.
know if that was a coincidence or if they just looked at the paper and said, "Wow, why did this guy choose this area? We better give it to him because nobody chooses that." So I think when you were telling me your story, I was so interested because it was just so different than mine, and I'm sure everybody's story is so different as it relates to
Yeah.
how they got into the front door. But so when you flew over,
Mhm.
did they have like, was it like a plane load of you guys? Or was it just like a bunch of jets on the same plane, or did you
Yeah.
go by yourself or
Yes. No. So there was a bunch of jets on the plane. We kind of all flew as one for the most part. If I remember correctly, there were kind of like two or three flights, and then you kind of chose one and then flew out. And so yeah, it was noisy with a bunch of freshly graduated college kids, right, on a plane together. So I feel sorry, probably felt sorry for everyone else on the plane. Everyone was super excited, and then we landed in Tokyo. And then I believe there was kind of a 2 to 3 day kind of orientation and seminar at like a very fancy hotel in the middle of Shinjuku. And Shinjuku is kind of like the center of Tokyo, very glamorous. It's where, all probably the most famous pictures of Tokyo are taken. And then after that, you're kind of either, if you're relatively close to Tokyo, you might take a train, or in my case, I was placed in a small kind of prefecture on the southern island of Kyushu. It's a very rural place. So I flew from Tokyo to Oita Prefecture, which is a very rural community, very mountainous. And yeah, when I landed, being an Angelino all my life, and a kind of a city kid, landing kind of in the middle of nowhere, the first thing I see in the summertime, because it's the summertime, just green mountains and everything. And I was like, I've never, literally, I think I told someone, one of my fellow Jets, like, I've never seen this much green before.
really?
Yeah, yeah, I was I remember she just laughed at me and she was like, you're definitely from LA. um and and yeah, I was just not necessarily shocked, but definitely like taken aback. As you probably noticed when you were in Japan, which is, the especially after during the rainy season, right, or during the seasons have such distinct looks, right?
Mhm.
And the summers, especially after it rains and kind of, it's hot and muggy, but there's so many different shades of green, right, about, because everything is kind of growing. And then in the fall, all the obviously the shades of fall and stuff like that. And so I was just kind of more awestruck by the amount of greenery coming from a city of freeways, right? So it was definitely a shocker.
When you so, speaking of your time and growing up in LA, like, when you think about, maybe you don't know, but, like, if you had to guess, like, what were your parents thinking when they're thinking, "Okay, Russell's about to get on a plane, he's about to go begin a new job halfway around the world in some small town." Were they high-fiving you? Were they nervous like some parents can get when their kid moves to a foreign country to begin the next chapter of their life?
Yeah, I think they were nervous, but not showing it. I think growing up, I had always kind of been a homebody and kind of a shy kid, and so this idea that I would kind of take this leap thousands of miles away, right? Because I also went to college relatively close, uh, in Orange County, which, I could drive home anytime I wanted, right? And so then to fly like 9 or 10,000 miles or however far Japan is from here, was a leap, right? And so they knew that I always wanted to do this. So they, I think they were excited, but they were also nervous, not knowing how both I would react. And I think I think for them, it could have gone both ways. Like, oh my God, my son is going. I'm really nervous for him. And it was probably also a little bit, oh my God, my son is going and he may never come back because he'll love Japan too much, right?
Ah, interesting.
So I think they had a lot of mixed emotions.
Yeah, I bet that's got to be hard for any parent, even if you were moving a state away, let alone, to your point,
Yeah,
thousands of miles away. And and you said you went over in 2006. So I'm thinking there's no video conferencing, there's nothing, right? I mean, it's just like
yeah.
old school landline pretty much.
For the
Maybe
most part,
email.
yeah,
Did
yeah.
did your
There
did
was
your parents use email at that time? Were they adopters of
Yeah,
email?
but but very, I think it was mostly for like important documents. Like if I needed something, it wasn't like a conversing thing. I remember one of the first things that I wanted to set up was getting my cell phone and then getting a landline, because at the time calling overseas even was really expensive over kind of cell service. And so that in itself was kind of a struggle, right? N- Now it's so easy for us to go, for example, on Zoom, right? Or just pop a webcam and we can literally talk to anyone at any time. But back in 2006, it wasn't that easy. Some of that technology was just coming out and it was really expensive, right? So a lot of us
Very
just had to
expensive.
settle, for a phone, and also limiting how much time we could talk to someone over the phone because of long distance charges. So when I look back on it now, it's kind of funny when you think about how hard it is versus how easy it is now, in 2021 to just call up someone, right? And actually or actually see their face.
Yeah, it is interesting. I take it for granted, man. I experienced it the way that you did as well when I moved over there, and now I take it for granted. I could FaceTime my wife. I could FaceTime you. I
Yeah,
could set up a Zoom, and I'm always curious. When you, to your point about the cost, is if you wanted to phone family or friends back here in the States, did you go the route of buying phone cards from the convenience store, or did you have like a third party service that you signed up for that attached to your landline that would just charge you by the minute?
yeah. So I had at the very beginning, I had phone cards. I would just go to the convenience store and buy however much. They usually bought like X amount of minutes. But then also, there was a service. So the internet companies at the time also offered, similar to now, offered special deals on like phone services. And there was one specifically, I believe it was actually Yahoo.
Hmm.
That offered, I believe it was Yahoo that offered services specific, not necessarily for international like expatriates or foreigners, but it was meant so that you could call long distance for relatively cheap compared to regular phone rates. And so I lived in kind of this really small community for the first year in Japan, and unfortunately that service wasn't available. And so, but then when I moved kind of into the suburbs of the main city of the prefecture, I was able to get that. So for the first year, I believe it was mostly like using public phones with my, or using, like you said, a phone card, just to call my family here.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, and at the time, it just seems normal, right? Like it's
Yeah,
just what you
yeah,
do. And I remember back at that time, turn of the century, and even into the early 2000s, Yahoo Japan was a big player in Japan. It was
for
very much
sure.
the dominant player. Google had zero market share, and there weren't very many domestic players. It was just that I can see the
Yeah,
logo and I can see the color in my mind's eye. I hadn't thought about
right.
it probably since I was there, but when you brought it up, I was like, oh yeah, of course, Yahoo Japan. Now, when you so you fly over. I'm assuming you flew into Narita Airport, or did you fly into
Yes.
Haneda?
No,
So,
Narita, yeah.
had you? Well, first of all, have you traveled internationally prior to moving to Japan? And had you been to Japan before, or was this like your first time out of the gate? Like, you know,
Yeah.
fresh passport.
No, so I had traveled to Japan, I believe twice prior. And the first time was just for kind of this youth group that I was a part of in high school. And then the second time, it was actually for JET. What I did was I had a friend that was studying abroad in Tokyo, and so I kind of saved up some money to fly and stay at his place. Just to, it was kind of like my insurance policy, like, am I really going to like Japan? Like, let me go there before I fully commit myself to go. So I flew and I stayed with him for about a week. And that was kind of what sealed the deal. Like, I want to experience more of this. And also he was super excited and was like, you need to live here. It's amazing. So those are kind of my experiences. But up until that point, that was kind of, Japan was the only place that I've gone. And also just to the cities, right? Like I had only been to like Osaka and then Tokyo, and not having any clue what the rural areas, right, or the less populated areas of Japan would be like, which is, I'm sure, foreshadowing a conversation about
Oh man, I mean,
that.
we could be here for days. I bet you've got some good stories. When you said that, I was thinking, you know, a few years back, I was doing a lot of international travel for work, and we were visiting a client in England, and it was a part of England called Kingston upon Hull, and locals in England just call it Hull. And it's on the east coast, the northeastern coast, and one could think of it as like maybe like a Baltimore of maybe not as glamorous as Baltimore. It's just a working class, old school, very old city. And when I would meet people either there in London or wherever, and they'd ask, why are you here? Oh, here for business. Oh, and they would just assume that I was there in London to do work. And I would say, no, no, I landed in London and taking the train up to Hull.
Mhm.
And people would pause and look at me and just say, why are you going up there? Oh my goodness. And for me as a foreigner, I didn't view Hull as bad. It was different,
Right.
but I would argue now in retrospect that even though Hull is a very specific place, and those of you that are from England listening to this are probably nodding your head, that it's a very unique place, yet it is one of the real flavors of England. It's not the
Yeah.
only real flavor of England, but it is real life. It's not the glamour of London. And
Right.
I think, your point about only visiting Tokyo and Osaka, I think most people that want to travel to Japan as tourists for like leisure, I think in their mind's eye, they think Japan equals Tokyo nightlife or Osaka nightlife. Like in their
Yeah.
mind's eye, like I think that most people think that. I don't think it's a bad thing. I just think to your point, like when you chuckled, the difference between where you were in Oita,
Yeah.
the difference between Oita and your initial days in Shinjuku for the orientation must have been in such stark contrast to the other.
Yeah, I think, to your point that, Japan is more than just those two cities, right? As any country is, right? Oita has definitely its own flavor, right? And it's a very unique experience, right? Sure, there's of course similarities, but it was Oita is a mountainous region, and there's a lot of valleys and there's a lot of nature, and there's just the amount of beauty that I've seen just in Oita alone, right? Um, whether it's the people or going on a hike or just kind of, I ended up having to get my own car. So I learned how to drive on the other side of the road as a result, but also that allowed me to go into kind of the mountain regions. I remember going, me and my friends found this like watering, like little river, that the water was so fresh that the locals would just get buckets and fill up buckets of water and drink straight from the stream, and then
Wow.
yeah, and right next to it, that's where like a bunch of kids played. And to this day, like, I don't remember how to get there. But it was like, it's almost like this magical experience where you kind of just happen to find something, and then you talk to the locals and they're like, oh yeah, go here, and then also drink some water because it's good for you, and don't worry about boiling it, and it's like, oh, that, I think as a city kid, but also, an American, we're like, what? Drinking water from a river? Are you insane?
You
Right?
guys, when you were growing up, you and your buddies didn't go down to the LA River with some buckets and just sop it up?
For your listeners that have never seen the LA River, river is a strong, strong word.
Yeah, that's being very generous. That's artistic
That is a
license.
generous word.
More
But
more
yeah,
aptly labeled as graveyard for shopping carts, bed frames,
exactly.
and graffiti
Yes,
tagging.
exactly. But yeah, like, there is a different kind of experience to be had, right? From Tokyo and Osaka to someplace like Oita, and it was great, because as someone from LA, I never experienced, going down to a river and swimming, or um, kind of spending my weekends hiking, or just hanging out with, some locals that, you know, just wanted to strike up a conversation because I didn't look quite Japanese, but I also looked Japanese, right? Or my Japanese sounded a little funny. And so it's definitely it was very much an eye-opening experience.
Did you talk about how lush it was and how mountainous it was. And to your point, you had to get a car because you had to get
Yep.
around and do your job and whatnot. Did were the I don't know how to word this. Were the mountains like its own character? Like, did the landscape define the flow of the day-to-day life in the local area, or like how neighborhoods were set up, or anything like that, or was it less dramatic?
No, for the most part, most of the towns were kind of in the valley portions, right? A lot of Oitaken is so mountainous that you can't really put a house anywhere. But you would see, kind of driving down, excuse me, the highway, like a random house, right, on the top of the hill, and you're like, I have no idea how to get there, but there's a house there, right? And then, and there were a lot of, ravines and rivers and stuff like that, and obviously most of the towns kind of lived by those kind of centers, right, where rivers met, or and it was kind of just sporadic, right? There was a town, you follow the river, and then maybe 10, 15 miles down, there's another kind of hamlet of a town, a couple buildings, and then just on until you basically enter the next prefecture.
Wow, it sounds so remote. It
Yeah, I uh, yeah, the town that I lived in for my first year was about an hour away from the main city, which in it of itself, especially compared to cities in California, let alone America, was actually quite small. And it had all the main things that you would need, but still, the train would only come maybe once an hour, and if you missed it, can't get into town for another hour. So that's why, especially out there, you needed a car.
Hmm. Did you? How, I'm always curious. How much were you able to learn about where you were going? Like, let's say if your knowledge and expectation of Los Angeles equaled 100% because you were a local, you grew up here, you lived here until you moved away. When you think about your time w- going to Oita, did you know, like, were you 80% confident that you knew a lot about where you were going, or was it like 10% and it was just like a big unknown? Like, how were you able to get information about where you were going?
So not a lot. So at the time, Google Maps, I believe, was probably like in beta. So, or Google Earth rather, right? And so the closest that you could like zoom in on Oita was like still really far away. Like, like if you zoomed in any closer, it would just be pixels, pixels of green. And so, and this is actually a true story. Because I minored in Japanese, I could at least type basic Japanese in my computer. And randomly, I found the way that I learned about the town that I lived in Oita was some kid drew a map, like with his crayon of the town and somehow uploaded it to the internet onto his website. And that was literally the only thing I had to go by um,
That's
before arriving
fascinating.
to
I've
my
never heard
town.
of anything like that. Wow.
Yeah, and he, I wish I kept out, or he or she or they, I like, I wish they kept, like, I kept it because it was literally like spot on. When I got there, I was like, oh, there's the bento shop. Bento is box lunch, like box lunch shop. Oh, look, there's the convenience store, and look, there's the high school. Like it was actually relatively spot on, but literally that was the only thing that I had of my town that I would call home for a year.
I find that back in that era, that was very common. What you just described, maybe not so much the crayon artistic rendition of the local area, but um, the the sheer unknown factor. I think about, we were talking earlier about taking things for granted. Being able to do a video conference or whatever. But
Yes.
even now, like if my wife and I are going to go on a road trip up the California coast, we're reading reviews. We're thinking about what Airbnb house we're going to stay at. We're looking at various maps. We're looking, to
Right.
your point, looking at Google Earth. We're looking at activities. We're making plans. And I take for granted that I can just get that kind of information, whether it's somebody who made a video on YouTube or listening to a podcast, frankly. And, that the, did you view it as being courageous in your mind, or did you view it as just like, well, it is what it is, like I'm just gonna get over there and figure it out?
I think a bit of both. I think, for me, I did want a lot of information, as much information as I could get. To your point though, now we have Yelp, we have Google, we have all of these things. And so we go in probably more prepared than ever, right? Into something unknown. And at the time, I think there is kind of this, well, I didn't know any better kind of attitude, right? Or this is it, so I'm just going to do it. And so um you know as I stayed in Japan and learned more, or even went to another prefecture or traveled, or just my daily life, right? For example, Japanese grocery stores are not situated like American grocery stores, right? So you walk into the unknown and you have kind of a preconceived notion of what something that you're used to, going in, for example, American grocery store, and then walking into a Japanese grocery store and going, nothing is where it's supposed to be, right? And you kind of just
Hmm.
roll with the punches, right? And but you're right, there is, at the time there wasn't like a YouTube video about like things to watch out for, or there was probably websites and stuff, but not specific to maybe the area that you're living in, right? I
Right,
remember,
right.
at one point I would have really odd cravings for American food or non-Japanese food, and like for example a hot dog, right? And or refried beans because I'm from LA, and I want some Mexican food, right? And the when I kind of look back on it now, just it's kind of just amazing how we were able to kind of make do, right? And be like, well, we don't have like a hot dog, but we have a sausage like hot dog. So we're gonna just roll with that, and put a bun around it and we're good, right? And so I think, it's definitely kind of this give or take of, you don't know what you don't know, and you pull with whatever resources you have at the time.
Yeah, you just figure it out. And yeah, when I talk to people that you know, relocate, and they're essentially starting a new chapter of their life working in a foreign country, and they've chosen this new path, this path beyond what they know. To your point, even just the subtleties or the mundane elements of going to a supermarket, or
Yeah.
how do I order food? Like, I find that people are surprised at how much we all take for granted in our daily home life. And it's not until we're, in a small town in Oita Prefecture like you, where you think everything is different. Where I ride my bicycle, how I go to the supermarket, how I communicate with the post office or the dry cleaner. Like, it seems that, and I've seen people get overwhelmed. It can be unbelievably isolating and overwhelming for people. And I saw it firsthand where people were having a really tough time. And at the time, I didn't really understand why, because they were going through their own challenges of relocating their life into a world of isolation. The Japanese people aren't,
Right.
they're not mean. And at the same time, they're not the most outgoing and warm and fuzzy to people that are strangers, because they're just not, I mean, as you know, they're just not sure how to interact with a foreigner sometimes. And
Right.
so it makes them a little bit trepidatious, not maliciously. It's just, I think it's a very common fact that people deal with when they go over there. And, I'm curious, did you have a situation or scenario or scenarios where you were like, oh man, this is a lot. Like, whew, like,
Yeah. No, for sure. So I think my first couple weeks in Japan were particularly difficult. I was when you're placed on the JET program, a lot of us tend to be placed in rural prefectures, and we have a supervisor in kind of that is also an English teacher that kind of helps situate you right in your town or whatnot. And the situation that I found myself in terms of an apartment was this very very old kind of broken down apartment. Uh, I it was basically a cement block. And no one had lived there for 10 years. And so, the images that pop to my mind are, like something out of a Japanese horror movie, right? Like a creepy, long-haired, scary lady is going to come out of nowhere and kill
in
me.
a
Uh,
nightgown
in a
floating.
nightgown, right? Like that's literally what I was thinking when I got there, because it was so old and there were cockroaches everywhere. There was there was no real running hot water, and so to go from kind of this city life or even kind of quote unquote modern life, right, of living in here in LA, and then to kind of something where the apartment was just not even up to standards for anyone, you know uh, I was having a really hard time because not only that, but my supervisor didn't live in the town that I lived in. She lived an hour and a half away, and so there was really no one, and there was no other jets at the time in my community. So I was really left to my own devices to figure out, well, I need a bed, right? I need food. Where do I get that? And I remember the first week that I got through the first week of school teaching kids and introducing myself over the weekend. One of my jet friends in the city was like, do you want to come over? So I took the train down there and I spent the weekend at my friend's place. And I was like, maybe like at that point I had no communication with my family after I left Tokyo, because I didn't have internet or anything. And so I called my parents, and I literally we were at, like, I bought a phone card. We were at the main kind of train station, and I'm on this like public phone because I didn't have a cell phone yet. And like I literally just like broke down. Like it was like, I was crying and I was just like, this is a mistake. Why did I do this? And and I think that was kind of that point where obviously there is nothing. At that point I was a grown adult, and after I let it out, obviously my parents could not fly and take care of it. So that's when I had to be like, okay, like I need to figure out how to fix this, right?
Mm.
And so it took about, 3 to 6 months. I eventually moved to a more modern apartment that didn't have cockroaches or lizards living in it with me. And then I think from there things got a lot easier, right? Because I was starting to situate myself. I knew where the basics were in my life, um, and I could at least go day to day, you know.
One step at a time. Yeah, it's your point. Day to
Yeah.
day, you just wake up and you just figure it out if there's a new challenge. And you'd mentioned that. So you didn't have a predecessor. Is that a fair understanding?
Yes. So not a true predecessor in someone that, yeah, came directly before me. I did have someone that had experience working in my town, but then she had moved on to another school.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think for the listeners to understand, there's a common tenet or phenomenon for new hire jet program employees, which is this dynamic of a predecessor where, like for example, with me, about a week and a half prior to flying to Japan, I got an email from a guy who was my predecessor. He was living in the apartment that I was going to be moving into. He was, which is very common, he was negotiating to try to get money from me because he was essentially leaving me a furnished apartment. And
Right.
it's a very common cycle. His predecessor did the same thing to him. And at the time, I didn't realize how helpful that was. He didn't share too much information with me. And um, it wasn't that he was unhelpful. It's just that I think that he probably didn't know what to share with me and I didn't know what to ask about. But I had a fully furnished apartment. I had He left me a bicycle, which was a score, which is great because I didn't even think about even needing a bicycle living out in the countryside, let alone a car. And hearing you say that you didn't have any of that, that adds a whole different layer of difficulty that I think most people have no concept of.
Yeah, it was, thankfully I had other jets that to help me, and really, especially the one jet that had worked in the town that I lived in. She was incredibly helpful, and did what she could. And that's why I think when I left, I eventually didn't stay in that town for too long. I got transferred into the suburbs. Um, and so that's where I kind of restarted that thread, right, with my successor, offering up my apartment, and then basically all of my furnishings, and my car, to him, because I didn't want anyone, at least in my, I guess, lineage, right, of jet lineage, to have to experience what I experienced.
That was really nice of you. 'Cause that's a big deal. It's a really big deal because it's hard enough, when you had that challenging moment where you had to get on the phone with your phone card, figure out how to make the darn phone card work, get
Yeah,
that going, get your parents on the other line, figure out what time it is, back in LA, what day it is, because the days and the times are different.
yeah.
And d- I'm assuming, was that a pretty notable inflection point for you? Once you got through that little milestone?
Yeah, I think for me, because up until that point, it had been nothing but excitement, right? I'm finally getting to do what I want. I've always wanted. It was like my dream is being fulfilled, right? Of going to Japan, and being part of the JET program. And then that's kind of when I think reality like smashed me on my face, right?
Mm.
That that this is kind of the real world, right? And I need to figure it out. This is not a vacation, and I think for me, that's, yeah, that phone call was kind of the beginning of me kind of working to, well, like you said, day by day, figuring out, well, how do I get through this day, until it was to the point where I felt that, I could enjoy myself, like enjoy the experience of living in a different country as a foreigner. But yeah, it took about 6 months, for me to fully appreciate it. And that was, a lot of, support from my friends that lived there, both Japanese friends that I made, along the way, as well as other jets older jets that understood what I was going through to some extent. They all pitched in to really make sure that I was okay.
That's great to hear that people supported you when you needed it, and they're strangers effectively, like
Yeah,
you don't know these people from Adam. They could, I mean, my
yeah,
assumption is that they're not all from Los Angeles. I'm assuming that they're probably from different countries.
yeah. And most of my friends were happened to be from New Zealand, Europe, all parts of Europe, obviously all parts of the US. And so there's actually only no one in my immediate area was from LA. And so we all came from different experiences, right? And I think at one point, probably a year or two after, when we were just all hanging out, grabbing drinks, we kind of laughed about how the jet program is a little bit like the real world or road rules, right? Um, Maybe some of your younger listeners might not know what that is, but you're hodgepodging together people from different personalities, people from around the world, and expect them to cohesively kind of get along and live together, right? And of course, friendships are to be made, drama is to be had, but all in all, you're kind of mashed together, right? And from that, you build really strong friendships from that, right? Because, adversity, can really sometimes bring people together, or drama can, challenging times or challenging things can bring people together.
Absolutely. I mean, that's like that's all throughout humanity, whether it's
Yeah.
people going to war together, surviving a catastrophic event together, being transplanted into a foreign land like y'all were. This
Hmm.
it's I mean, to your point, that adversity can tend to kind of be like an adhesive to some degree, in a positive way. Were you were you learning about those other cultures as well? I mean, obviously you're learning a ton about Japan, I'm assuming every single day. But to your point, like you mentioned, like you befriended a bunch of people from New Zealand and European countries. Like, did you know much about those countries that they came from?
Not particular. Yeah, not particularly. And it was great. I think it was great. That is a great side effect, I would say, of the JET program, right? Is that you get to meet people from if you're American, you get to meet people from New Zealand, Australia, Europe, or there were a couple of people even from, like, for example, like China or South Korea and stuff like that. And so one of the really funny things that kind of happened to me was that because a lot of my friends were from New Zealand, or from like England, I would start picking up their slang, just because it was easier to, or kind of their terms for certain things, just because it was easier to kind of communicate that way, because most of them were of that nationality, right? So an
Hmm.
example is like, we tend to, as Americans, say, I gotta go to the gas station, right? Or I got to go get gas. And they say petrol, right?
Hmm.
And so eventually I just adopted that, because it was just easier for me to say it that way than have them say, well, what do you mean? What's gas, right? Or oh, you funny Americans and your funny terminology, right? And so you start to really kind of pick up on each other's kind of ways of communicating, but also learn about, like, Australia, New Zealand. And then kind of those friendships are great because, for example, like 5 or 6 years ago, one of my really good friends came to visit me here in LA, and we were so close in New Zealand. I mean, sorry, in Japan, that it felt like we hadn't seen each other in a couple days, and we were just like hanging out, drinking in LA. But now we're in LA and not in Japan, and everyone around us understands that we're speaking English instead of a few people.
It's I happen to befriend quite a few New Zealanders and Australians as well, coincidentally. And it was very educational for me, like you said. And one of the funny things that I learned very quickly about New Zealanders, and I think even Australians, at least the people that I've met over the years, even subsequently, is that they're they have a really interesting way of telling you what it's not. So like if I had asked an American friend like, "Hey, how was the train ride?" And if it was a long one, they might go, "Oh man, it was a long train ride. I'm glad to be here. Let's go grab something to eat." But if I would ask my Kiwi friends, they'd say, "Oh, it's not bad. No, it wasn't bad. It wasn't bad. Hey, like they'd always like put a positive spin on things. They tell you what it's not. Like they wouldn't
Right.
focus on the
That's
negative."
actually,
And I was
it's
like,
actually funny that you say that. I
did you
agree.
catch that at all with some of your friends? Did
I,
they ever
I,
do that?
I, I did. And what's funny is I wonder if that's where, now that you pointed out, if that's where I pick up. I often say when something, I say, oh, it wasn't terrible.
Hmm, hmm.
When someone asks me how things were, and it wasn't good, but it wasn't like really that, it wasn't bad. I'll say, oh, it wasn't terrible. So I'm wondering if that's where I picked that up from.
Well, it's interesting you do to your point about, you know, terminology and slang, your example about petrol and gasoline as
Yeah.
a simple example. And when I'm hearing that, I'm thinking, okay, well, here's this guy, Russell, who on the other side of a supermarket might look like a local guy. He's got black hair, he looks pretty Japanese out of the corner of the eye, you know. Oh, I don't realize that he's a foreigner until maybe I interact with him or I hear him talk or something. And so you're always in some capacity, you're always assimilating every day. Like even if it's not explicit and overt, but you're always in the process of assimilating in like these little micro decisions or these little micro scenarios. And as you were talking about your friends from other foreign countries, it sounds like you're doing that at the same time with them as well, whether it's adopting speech patterns or learning about where they're from, um, sharing memories there together because you're all foreigners at the same time. And did you find that that type that ability to not only just assimilate but just assimilate concurrently in different ways, was that always something that you had, growing up in LA, or is it something that just was by necessity now that you're living in the countryside of Japan?
I think one of the things, and LA is such a diverse city, and there's so many different, ethnic groups and identities, people that identify, in all sorts of ways that, and then there's kind of this also being Japanese American, this notion that in America I am of Japanese descent, right? That the Japanese, that the especially with Asian Americans in general, that there's kind of this idea of foreign, right? No matter how long your family's been in America,
Mm,
and so this idea of always assimilating and not necessarily compromising, but working for better understanding, I think
mhm.
is kind of sometimes innate, right? And whether it's because I want to make sure that someone knows that I'm quote unquote extra American, or to so that to accommodate someone, to make them either feel better or feel more comfortable, right? That's something that um, I always kind of grew up doing. And so for me in Japan, it was easier to kind of I kind of felt it as an olive branch, right? Like to really kind of connect different cultures together or different ideas together, that hey, I'm more than, like I want this to be a happy and good relationship, right? So I'm willing to, not that it was contentious, but I'm willing to kind of, adapt, right?
There's two things that jumped out to me when you were talking about that. It's fascinating that, the point that you made, I thought was really profound, that To assimilate, you said to assimilate wasn't to compromise, it was to better understand or to better connect. It was something like that that you the way you stated it, and I never heard anybody put it that way. And I think that's exactly what it is. Because to your point, you're not abandoning who you are as Russell, for example, or Russell the American, or Russell the male American, or whatever, however people are classifying you in the moment, that you're you're willing to, and I guess this is the second piece that jumped out to me when you said that, which is in order for there to be any kind of assimilation or any kind of increased shared understanding, some party has to be vulnerable and take that first step. And to your point about the olive branch, like if you weren't willing to, even if it was like a simple scenario, not like you being an ambassador and having like this big olive branch and it's a serious event, but even just in a simple case of like waiting for a train or getting something in the convenience store, somebody's got to be willing to be vulnerable first. And if nobody does, then people don't connect. Like or we have a bunch of misconnections, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that's, one of the things that I, especially with Japanese people, which is, I kind of always took the idea that I am a guest in your country, and so I don't want, like, it's really important for me that I'm the one that's in your kind of territory or in your realm. So if I don't, for example, learn Japanese, or if I don't try, right, to understand, then there is no point for, or why would you even attempt to try to understand me, right? And so being in Japan in particular kind of made me realize that, I can't be kind of the person that's like, well, I am the I am the teaching assistant that knows all about the world, you don't, listen to me, right? Like that just was never going to work. And rightfully so, it shouldn't. And so it was really, to me, at least in my mind, incumbent upon me to kind of take that step, right? And I don't, I think the way you put it, vulnerability is exactly it. But I don't think it's not in any way a weakness, right? It's a um, in fact, it's a strength to be so confident in kind of who you are, to be able to do that, so that you can better communicate and you can better kind of build a relationship.
Hmm. Yeah, it's almost like that's like one of the various lubes that greases the social cog, especially
Yeah.
there. Because I mean, as you know, you know probably better than me the sheer complexity of the social fabric that's unspoken in that country, and to
Hmm.
try to navigate that as a foreigner is it's almost like going down a roaring rapids blindfolded with no paddles. It just you
Right.
just kind of hope and trust that you're going to do the right thing in the right moment, and if you don't, you scrape yourself up, you wipe off your pants and you get back up and you do it again. And as you're talking about this, I have to assume that you either knew people or observed people that didn't share that same mindset as you, other foreigners that maybe weren't um, as apt to want to try to extend a hand and try to maximize a mutual understanding. I mean, is that a fair assumption? I know I saw it all the time.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I think, yes, I think there are people that kind of, uh, either because they became jaded of this situation, but also that I think sometimes, you get into a situation, and, sometimes you do, as a foreigner, where you're not kind of in your own home, you do kind of enter these states of like homesickness, right? Or depression or whatever. And sometimes that gets the better of you, right? And sometimes, like the stereotype of, crazy American in foreign country can be true, right? Where you do see foreigners, other foreigners or other Americans or other nationalities, just not respect the fact that they are guests in another country, right? And it is incredibly cringy and
Hmm.
cringeworthy,
It
right?
is. It
to
really
to see
is.
that, because um especially as a jet, you are an ambassador to your country within that community, right? And I think one of the difficult things, though, to I think not to defend them, but is that a lot of jet people on the jet program are relatively young, right? They're fresh out of college, and that college mindset might still be in their head or whatnot, and so sometimes that comes out in very bad ways, right? Or very
Mm,
disrespectful ways, rather. And it not only puts kind of it made me more self-aware not to be like that.
yeah, especially when it can be observed on the faces of the people that are experiencing that type of acting out.
Exactly.
You can just cut that tension with a knife, and
Yeah.
and rightfully or wrongfully, it's guilt by association. Oh, they're a foreigner too, so they must be that way also.
Right.
And that is unfortunate. It is a bit of a missed opportunity. And I don't know, what do you? I've heard other people say. I have some friends that were in the Peace Corps, and even friends that just had moved abroad for work, that already had families, that already had kids in school, and I've heard a similar sentiment shared with me that, to your point about being an ambassador, they've shared the same
Mhm.
sentiment with me. Their situations are different, but they it, it's almost like they're comparing it to like the celebrity who says, um, "Hey, I'm not a role model. Like, don't put that pressure on me." And they're like, and people in the public is like, it doesn't matter if you want to be a role model or not. You're the best musician, or you're the best athlete, or the best business person. Tough break. You are. And I've had my friends say the same thing. They're like, I don't want to be the ambassador of Canada or America in this town that
Yeah.
I live in, or this new employer that I work for. And they're like, but I kind of am. I can't get away from it. I mean, do you see any similarity there too for you?
Oh, for sure. I think especially in the rural communities where there aren't a lot of foreigners, right? You might be the only foreigner that someone has ever met, right? So, like a lot of my students, for example, had never met a foreigner, let alone my added layer of being a Japanese American foreigner that looked like them, but also speak Japanese really funny, but also had a perfect American English accent. Um, so that and so I understand that sentiment completely, and I also felt that, like, why do I have to be the one, right? Or why do our, like, and some of our, my group of friends would be like, why do we always have to be good? Well, X does like crazy XYZ, right? And unfortunately that's just the way of the world, and that is true of whether you're in Japan and or a Japanese person being a quote unquote ambassador somewhere else in the world, right? Like that is just, if you are the only foreigner someone meets, then then there is a greater chance for that person to think ill of you if they see something, all ill of all foreigners if they see something you're doing as bad, right?
Hmm.
And so it can be an incredibly complex and challenging situation, especially when you do have someone that is acting out improperly, and you kind of like not covering for them, but also just like adding that extra layer of don't worry, it's just him.
Hmm. Hmm.
Right? like he's not normal, like he's not like like he's just acting out very poorly. He doesn't represent everyone.
Right. He represents himself, not us as foreigners. And that's hard to convey sometimes because, you know, the the average Japanese person in rural Japan can't tell the difference between a Canadian and an American. Like they just, or sometimes even a person from England versus a person from Australia. Like, of course, like they can't discern. They just, okay, they're all just one group of, they're a wild bunch, drinking out on a train or getting wild. You, you said something funny that brought a smile to my face. It's an interesting dynamic that, to your point, maybe your Japanese wasn't native level, and you looked like it maybe could have should have been in the eyes of, say, some stranger in your town, But meanwhile, you're an American dude who speaks perfect American English. Were there any how did that manifest? Like, were there awkward situations or like any hijinks or unique challenges that maybe that other not just other Japanese Americans might have experienced over there, but maybe even other people, other Asian Americans or Asian Englanders or Asians from Toronto? Like, what is that dynamic? Like, tell me about a story or two that where that got interesting for you.
Yeah, it's so it is definitely an interesting dynamic. Um, I think the best story I have to kind of encapsulate this is, I think it was my first night that I had arrived in my tiny little town, and I had my little broken down apartment, and I was like, I need to go eat. And so I think I walked down to the local family restaurant, which is it was called Joyful, and it's basically like a Denny's or like a IHOP, Japanese version of it. And I walk in, and the host comes up to me, and he says something just incredibly quickly in Japanese. And up until that point, like both in college, I had learned Japanese from a teacher, so obviously Japanese was spoken a little bit more slowly, and people knew that Japanese was not my first language. But he spoke so quickly that I actually didn't understand or catch what he said, and I gave him this look, and he immediately just stopped. He put down all of his menus, proceeded to grab me kind of by the arm and walk me slowly to a booth. And I realized that I think he thought that I had some sort of disability.
Oh
Um,
man. Whoa.
and yeah, and so finally, when it kind of clicked, I had to explain that, like in Japanese, that, like, oh, by the way, like, I'm really sorry, can you speak more slowly, I'm actually a foreigner. Which then kind of opened up a can of worms of, but you look Japanese. And then I say, well, I'm American. And then usually it was like, but you don't have blonde hair and blue eyes. And I will say that that conversation repeated itself several times throughout my 3 years in Japan, uh,
Oh
to the point
man.
where I finally got so tired of, like, I knew to a T what the next question was going to be after the next one, after the next one, that I had this whole script memorized for me should anyone ask about my lineage and heritage.
You just press play and you go on autopilot.
It pretty much, it was like a voice, yeah, message, just hit play and just go.
Well, I think that's an interesting point you make, Russell, and I think that there's something there that even goes beyond being a foreigner living and working in a different country. That naivete doesn't always mean someone's trying to be nasty. And when I experience similar situations, maybe not the exact because I'm not Japanese American, but when I experience similar situations like what you just described, where I could predict where it was going to go, how it was going to be misinformed. On the bad days, I get really frustrated, not outwardly at the person, just in my mind. I'd be really irritated because maybe I was having a rough week. And
Right.
and it wasn't until years later that I realized that, you know what? Like, none of those people were trying to be ugly. They weren't trying to be rude. They weren't trying to be racist. They weren't trying to be anything. They just didn't know and they were trying to understand. And in that moment, they were learning, even though it was repetitive for us. And I think even like in today's modern climate, it seems like sometimes it's harder for people that just don't know to be open and honest about what they don't know, because then people might assume that they're this or they're that, or that they have some sort of
Right.
intent that they don't. And I don't know about you, but for me, I personally feel very thankful that I did have those repetitive, stereotypical conversations, because it makes me realize that, oh, people are complex and people can't
Yeah.
help where they grew up and what they've been exposed to. And if they haven't been exposed to what real America is like, it's not their fault. They live in backwater Japan. Like, what do they know? They know Baywatch or Hollywood movies, you know?
Right. And I think, no, that's exactly right. I think by doing that, and having kind of honest conversations, right? And, no one was particularly rude, right, to me when they would ask me. It was just like you said, a genuine curiosity. And even for me, one of the great things in when I was talking to a lot of these people was I also learned about, like, for example, I met someone, she asked about my history, and I had just casually asked, oh, have you been out of Japan? And she was like, oh yeah, I backpacked, like, the world for like 5 years. And I spent 2 years in the Middle East, and learning Arabic and stuff like that. And I was like, that's insane, like, and so you also kind of learn that your preconceptions about maybe what people around you are, especially like in rural Japan or wherever, that you also learn, right? And
Hmm.
by just kind of giving your rote whatever script that you have, you've also now opened up the door to learn about this person, right? And their story a little bit. And hey, maybe you'll never see this person again. I once, at one point, I was having a really bad, like you said, I was having a really bad week. It was probably towards the end of my tenure in Japan, and I really didn't like. I think, running or working out or something, and this guy strikes up a conversation with me, and then he was like, oh, your Japanese sounds kind of funny. And I didn't really like, I just wanted to work out, like, and just like clear my mind. And so I just casually said, oh yeah, I'm from Tokyo, um, in Japanese. And he kind of believed me. And then as he went, I was like, oh no, like I'm gonna get myself in trouble. So I finally kind of told him, I'm sorry, but like, I didn't explain. But from that, like, I learned that, I come from a family that does judo, and so does he, and we got on this deeper conversation of judo. And then, we're at the end of it, we're like laughing, and my bad day went away. I never saw the guy again. But I think that there's opportunity there, right? When you open yourself up a little bit, and even if it's, like you said, the same story over and over and over again, to that person it's like a totally new story, right? Like, for a lot of what I've learned actually is that a lot of, especially at that time, not a lot of Japanese knew about the Japanese American experience. And so for me, it was almost like learning words that I didn't even think I needed to learn, right? So that I could properly explain, the history of Japanese Americans, and my family in America, So I had to like look up some random words, and also, also explain that Japanese culture and Japanese American culture is kind of like an offshoot, right? There are things in Japanese American culture that we do that either have gone out of like tradition in Japan, or were made up traditions based on the climate of Japanese Americans at the time. So it was a really interesting experience, understanding that, like, yes, I am of Japanese descent. I live in Japan, but I'm not Japanese, right? And I actually feel more American in Japan than I feel in America, and so it kind of led to a cathartic experience almost,
Interesting.
on so many different levels, right? And this all just kind of came from basic conversations, right, that I would have with random strangers, because they heard me speak English, right, or they heard me say like a Japanese word a little funny. Um, so yeah, it's definitely kind of, I think, what you take from it, or what you get from it, is probably greater than that like little thing that you give, right?
Hmm. When you said, when you made the point that, hey, look, I felt more American living in the mountainous region of nowhere, Japan, you know, what, like, what traits about yourself that you think are American at that time that you said, you know what, wow, I do this and it's kind of a unfortunate thing that I've learned to do as an American versus, you know what, hey, I do this other thing And I'm super proud that I do this as an American. You know, I'm not Japanese. I am an American person, and I'm glad that I do this as opposed to not doing that. Are there any things that jump out to you?
Yeah, I don't know if I would frame it necessarily in kind of at least the way that I thought about it in that context. It was more things that excuse me, I didn't know. Well, things I didn't know in kind of Japanese culture that I thought I had a pretty good handle on, both studying Japanese in college, but also being part of a Japanese American family. But also just I guess you can say my general thought process, right, and attitude towards things was very different. I was much more American than Japanese, right? So I think, for example, how I explain things, right, tends to be a little bit more or very much more American. And then when I translate that into Japanese, as I speak Japanese, that's when I realize that is not how a Japanese person would express what I just said,
Mhm, mhm.
right? Because for me, I think about it in English and in an American mindset, and then I literally translate that out into Japanese, right? Or the way I think of things sometimes can be very American, right? Like, or maybe kind of Western or whatnot. I think one of the funny things is holding the door open. I know it's like really small, and I don't know if this is a uniquely Western or American thing, but it's quite common, right? Like if someone is coming to, as you see them coming and you have the door, you kind of hold the door open, right? That's not as common in Japan, at least from what I experienced, and it's not a bad thing, right? But little things like that, where I was like, oh wow, that's interesting, you know. And I also from my friends, non-American friends, right? The way I would express myself. Or I remember one of my friends straight up, I met her like in talking to her in the first 10 minutes, she was like, stop, you're from California, huh?
Wow.
And I was like, how I don't even know how you knew that. Like, other than obviously I don't have, you know, I don't have a Boston accent. I'm not from Brooklyn, you know,
Mhm.
and she said, like, you have a very Californian accent. And I was like, oh, that's so interesting, right? And so there's just things like that, right? Little things that I picked up on as I lived in Japan that made me go, oh, I am an American after all, right? Like, um, kind of, yes, like, you know, that for the most part, how I think about things, how I react towards things can be very American. I think one of the not silver linings, but one of the kind of really weird things that I every year that passed that I lived in Japan that I was able to do, I remember I nicknamed it the poof, and that meant that like I could disappear into a crowd and no one would know where I was at
Mhm.
because I look Japanese, right? And that was really interesting. I think that was something that like having like not sticking out was really interesting for me as an American. Being able to kind of be around people that look like you, and being able to just like, for example, not have to maybe worry about some of the things that I worried about, you know, growing up as a kid, where, you know, someone might have said a racial slur to me in passing because I just walked past them, right? Like there was none of that for me in Japan. So that was a really interesting kind of experience that I had that that always kind of stuck in the back of my mind.
That's an interesting point. You know, that's the 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 two other guys that lived nearest to me where I lived were all like me. We were all 6 foot tall. We're all blonde haired, and we all had bluish greenish eyes. And one was from England, one was from Canada, one was from America. And our joke was, the reality was is that people kept tabs on us in our town, and they'd
Right.
report back to the school. You know, if we were there were eyes and ears everywhere, and I'm sure that probably happened for every community where there was a jet. employee. But our chuckle to ourselves was that there is zero anonymity for us. Like, even if we're
Yeah.
a quarter mile away or in a dense crowd, you know, across the street, like, everyone could see us. Everyone knew what we did, where we went, when we did it, with who we did it. And we found that for us, yeah, guys, it's so interesting because your concept of the poof wasn't even a tool that we even considered in our tool belt, because we knew it was not even a possibility living in a small farming town. And we found that we would have to um, isolate ourselves, whether it be individually, like, I'm gonna not go out, or I'm not gonna go grab dinner. I'm just gonna stay inside because I just don't want to be on someone's radar, even if it's
Right.
innocuous. And there were times where we would just get together from time to time, and someone would go to the convenience store and grab a couple of tall cans of beer, and someone would throw on the propane heater, and we could finally, like, relax, because
Right.
we were always under the microscope. And that's so interesting, not only that you were able to blend, learn how to blend when you needed to, but that it was that it was the first time you were able to do that. Because as an American, to
Right.
your point, you're going to stand out, because if you live in an area that has a lot of Latinos, hey, who's that Asian looking guy? Oh, that's Russell. Or, if I'm a white dude in a predominant black part of town, they're like, well, who's that guy? Oh, that's Brendan. He's the white dude. Like, it's interesting that you got to experience that in Japan, of all places.
Yeah, it was, I mean, by no means did it work all the time, because the second I opened my mouth, it was apparent that I wasn't I wasn't Japanese, but he didn't want to attract attention. For me, it was nice being able to go out, right? And not necessarily having to worry about attracting attention.
And that actually brings up a point that I wanted to ask you about, around, you know, depression slash homesickness slash loneliness, because I think everyone, no matter where they're living, if they're a foreigner in some foreign land, there's always an element of that at some point, whether it's consistent or if it's periodic or if it's one big event. Like, did you find that you were, dealing with that same thing that most other foreigners do?
For sure. I think there were just kind of times, and it wasn't necessarily like a specific thing that triggered it, but there would be times where I would get homesick, or you know um I would just feel really down. And part of that is because um the inability to kind of express yourself fully, right?
Hmm.
Of course, to other English speakers you can, and if you have other Americans, then you can kind of understand culturally. But to have to explain kind of your feelings or something much deeper in your second language is incredibly difficult.
Hmm.
Um, both from a sense of not only having to kind of think about it in your kind of mother tongue and the way you think, but then to express it in another language so that someone, that person can understand, is not easy, right? And so there were times where I would feel down, or I would feel particularly homesick. And that was always hard. I had like weird quick fixes. So I would like for me, like my life revolves around food. So I would cook like something very American, right? Or I was lucky enough, especially when I moved to kind of the suburbs of this small city. There was a mall that looked unusually American, like it, and it had a sports authority, which is no longer around, but at a sports authority, it had a Gap, it had like Americanish type stores.
Wow.
um yeah, I was, and on the radio they would play radio, like the top 40 hits from Hawaii. Um, so it was like a Hawaiian radio station, and I was like, halfway to LA, so close enough. And so, I would actually go there, and not even with anyone, just by myself, and walk around, just to kind of get kind of out of my funk, and I might, I would probably walk into the Gap or Sports Authority or something, just to feel like I was at home a little bit.
That's great that you had that outlet and that you realized that you needed to do something like to get yourself out of that mood or out of that weird vibe. And I think everybody goes through it, like everybody that I've talked to, no matter where they are, who they are, where they've lived, or how much they traveled, it's just the ebb and flow. And I agree with you. There's something exhausting trying to share your feelings in a foreign tongue. It's just so difficult to do because the point you made earlier about how we construct sentences and communicate thoughts as Americans and how that differs from how a Japanese person might. I know what you mean. I don't know about you, but for me, I realized that as an American, or maybe not an American, maybe just as me as an individual, but I assumed that it was because I was American, that I had a habit of like stating these disclaimers or embedding these excuses as to why I didn't, or why I did something that wasn't appreciated or expected. Like, for example, like, hey, sorry I'm late, but there was a traffic jam. Or,
Right.
oh, sorry, I forgot about the event. I wrote it down on a piece of paper and I accidentally threw it away. When I heard myself saying that in English and then trying to translate that into Japanese, it sounded so wrong culturally in Japanese. And
Right.
and I started to pay attention to people and I realized that, oh, Japanese people just own it. Hey, I'm late.
Right.
I got no excuse. I'm late because that's all that really matters is that I'm late and I was inconsiderate in me being late. It doesn't matter why. Could have been a tsunami, could have been, a meteor, it could have been because I was lazy. Doesn't really matter. I'm late and that affected you adversely. So I'm just going to acknowledge it. And I thought, man, how often do I do that? And maybe I'll never know if it's because I was American or if it was because it was just me. Um, but yeah, those kinds of reassessments of how we talk and communicate is either eye opening or even to your point about having those darker days is downright difficult, downright exhausting.
Yeah. Yeah. There were, I think, a lot of people kind of sometimes they just wake up and they're like, you know, feeling a little down or feeling a little homesick, and um, they're, and you're right. And, for some people, there are triggers. Like for me in particular, there was no trigger, or at least just consciously, I didn't know if there was, there were just days where I woke up and I'm like, I'm feeling homesick, right? Or I'm feeling depressed, maybe, and I don't want to have to explain it to anyone, or try to explain it in another language, so either I'm just going to stay home or go to the mall or, and just like kind of be by myself, or if you had friends, that you could relate to, go hang out with them, right?
Hmm. So when you said you did what 3 years there, so you wrapped up in '09,
Hmm.
and you, you you know there's all the challenges of moving back. What do you do with all your belongings that you accumulate over time in Japan and whatnot? So you get all those logistics sorted out. Do you move straight back to Los Angeles or do you go somewhere else?
So so after my tenure ended, I spent 2 additional weeks just backpacking around Japan as my stuff was getting sent home. Um, and then I came back to LA.
Was readjustment back into America and LA more difficult or less difficult than your original adjustment of adjusting to Japan?
I wouldn't say it was difficult. It was different. So similarly, of kind of things that you take for granted. So, for example, in Japan, especially in the kind of outside of the major cities, ATMs have business hours. So you can't just grab cash at any point. Similarly, facing the real world here back at home, I forgot certain things. So um, in Japan, it is an incredibly safe country in terms of no one's going to usually steal your stuff. And oftentimes you'll just see people leave like their backpacks or their purse to reserve it or just to leave it on the table as they go order food, for example, right? And so there were little things like that that I forgot about living here in America, of being a little bit more cautious about those things. I also I realized because I was teaching English, and oftentimes I would speak a little bit more slowly or phrase things in a way that made it easier, more easily understood, that my sentence structure had changed, how I spoke normally. So, and my parents actually were the first people to realize that. They were like, wow, you sound like the way you construct sentences is different, you know? And so, there was kind of this kind of relearning how to assimilate back into kind of living here in the US. Um, yeah, it took a little while. And I think obviously, having the Jet Alumni Association as a resource was nice. I also happened to come home pretty much at the height of the Great Recession. So it was an interesting time to come home.
Were there certain things that you learned in Japan that you carried into your new chapter of living back in America and that maybe even leverage now, all these years later as a professional?
Yeah, I think just in general, professionalism. I know that sounds kind of weird, but in Japan, there's a term for a person that has now entered society, and it's shakaijin, and that means like literally person of society, and essentially that kind of loosely translates to being like a professional. And there is this work ethic, especially as you work as a teacher, because you are a representative of the government, that you need to act a certain way and represent yourself a certain way, of, for example, being on time, making sure your stuff is done, being a respectful citizen, right? That all kind of flowed, into my work life even now, right? Where, not only working as a professional, those 3 years really kind of helped me understand what that meant. But then also just teaching in general. I I don't know who doesn't think that like teaching is such a useful skill, and it should be like if you have it, a highly valued skill, of being able to explain things or being able to teach things, because I use that every day of my life, my professional life in particular, where I'm constantly explaining things or I'm constantly teaching things, right? Especially to maybe an audience that either has never heard of the concept that you're talking about, or doesn't care. Right? And so those are, I think, two skills that really kind of stuck with me even
Mm.
today.
And when geez, I mean, since I've known you, you've been in digital gaming the majority of your professional life since being back. Is that right?
Yeah, I've been in like doing video game stuff for about 10 years now. So yeah.
Interesting. So are you ever interfacing with Japanese culture at all, or is that a in the business context? Like, do you have Japanese customers or um, that kind of thing, or is that or now are you just pure gaming here in America and Jap-
Yeah, I so I did I worked for a couple of companies that work closely with Japan, gaming companies that work closely with Japan kind of early in my career. And so I would actually fly back once a year. But more recently, I've pretty much, most of my dealings are with, usually just, other like American companies, and I don't necessarily interface too much with Japan anymore.
Mm. But it's still, I mean, obviously because your lineage, but lineage aside, just your time living there and changing, it's got to still be with you on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. I'm guessing. Like,
Yeah, it's so funny because you asked that question earlier about, do you ever feel homesick or kind of down when I was in Japan, right? And even today, there are days where or times where I'm like, man, I wish I was still back in Japan.
mm,
And so it's kind of reversed itself,
interesting.
so to speak. Where there are times where I'm like, man, I wish I was, and maybe this is because I'm older now, and and would love to recapture my youth, but but looking back on those times, because it's been well over 10 years since I've been back, that there are times where I go, I wish I was back in Japan, or being able to travel in Japan, experiencing X, Y, or Z, you know,
Hmm.
um, and I mean, I would say it comes less often than it did in reverse when I was in Japan, but there are definitely times where I'm like, would be nice.
Yeah, it makes me wonder. I have the same thing, Russell, and it makes me wonder sometimes, is that a common thing as people get older? Do people reflect back on, the days when they played football in high school, or the days when maybe they were in the military, or, iconic moments in their lives, these watershed moments where people look back and say, man, those were the days, like for whatever reason, whether it was
Right.
exciting or they changed. And yeah, I know exactly what you mean. I have the same, because it's almost like you can never get it back. That no
Yeah.
matter how badly, let's say you just decided next week you were going to fly back to Oita or to some other place, it wouldn't be the same. You're a different person. It's a
Yeah.
different country. Like you know, before we wrap, I want to get your take on, any insights that you might have for people thinking about Japan, whether it be moving over there. Maybe it's somebody that wants to be a jet. Maybe it's someone who doesn't know anything about Japan, but they just want to travel there as a foreigner. What are there any? I'd like to get inside your brain a little bit and understand before we wrap up the conversation today around what do people need to think about, or what do they think? What do you think people need to know before they come and start to interact with people in Japan?
Yeah, I think, like any other country, Japan is, a geographically diverse area. There is city, there is rural, there's all sorts of people. I think going there with an open mind, and you can say that about any country, but really, you know, I think there is kind of the quote unquote movie version of what you see Japan as, right? And it's usually kind of this like Blade Runner type of hyper futuristic kind of country, right? Which it is, and the city of Tokyo and the city of Osaka and and the big cities are incredible metropolises, right? Um, One thing I would say is that the city, of course, you want to see the sights, but get out of the city, right? And also understand. I think if anything that I took away from living in Japan was that uh, that as I mentioned earlier, you are a guest in that country, right? And so it is your chance to learn um, about that country. If you're going there to genuinely learn, right? Is to keep an open mind and respect the country as if someone was entering your house as a guest, right? Or how you would want to enter someone's house as a guest, right? With respect. And it's okay to make mistakes, Japan and the Japanese people are human like all of us, right? And But I think to your point earlier is to kind of if you make a mistake, that's okay. Get up and try again, right? As long as the intention is good, as long as you're respectful, like it's gonna be fine.
Absolutely. I mean, what a what a great way to go out on our conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time, and I know the listeners do too. And I was excited, you know, to have this conversation with you. And I think all the listeners now know why, and that you always have had such a very specific insight and perspective on being a foreigner or even Japan or your time in Japan. And it's refreshing, and it was really great to spend this time talking with you. Is there anything you want to share with any of the listeners before we jump, or are you good?
No, I'm good. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. I had a lot of fun. It's
Me
great.
too.
It's great talking about some of this stuff and bringing back some old memories.
Well, we should definitely get you on again down the road, because I'm sure there's so much we didn't even scratch the surface on, where we could
For sure.
geek out on some of the some of the glory days, if you will. But thanks again, man. I really appreciate you taking the time.
No, thank you.